The President of the United States stood at a fundraising dinner in Washington and said, out loud, to a room full of Republican lawmakers, "I won't use the word war, because if you use the word war, you need approval. 7,000 strikes, 50,000 troops, Marines on amphibious assault ships." And the man ordering all of it just explained, in plain English, exactly why he chose his words carefully. That statement is the most consequential thing said about this conflict, and almost nobody picked it up. Not because it was hidden, because it was said openly, at a dinner, and then filed away under the noise of daily strike updates. But what he described is a legal and constitutional sleight of hand that has been building in American politics for over 70 years. And understanding it is the only way to understand what is actually happening in Iran right now. The Constitution is clear, or it reads as clear. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to declare war. Not the President, Congress. That was a deliberate choice by the founders, who had watched European monarchs drag their nations into wars on personal ambition alone. They wanted a check, they built one in. And then over 8 decades of practice, that check was quietly, systematically bypassed. Open loop 2, nobody stopped it. Why? This episode follows that question. From the last real declaration of war in 1942 through Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and into the Iran campaign of 2026. It is a story about a power that was never formally taken. It was simply never defended. Stay with us, because the answer changes how you see every military decision made in your lifetime. The last time the United States formally declared war was June 5, 1942, a declaration against Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania, 3 junior Axis powers, following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Since that moment, the United States has fought in Korea, Vietnam, Lebanon, Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, twice Libya, Syria, and now Iran. Not one of those involved a formal congressional declaration of war. That is not a coincidence or an oversight. It is a pattern, and the pattern has a logic. Each president who deployed forces without a declaration set a precedent the next president inherited and expanded. Truman called Korea a polis action. Johnson escalated Vietnam under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a blank check Congress handed him after an attack that was, at minimum, misrepresented. Each step made the next one easier, and the constitutional check grew weaker with every use. Congress tried once to push back. In 1973, after Vietnam, lawmakers passed the War Powers Resolution over President Nixon's veto. The law required the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying troops, and to withdraw them within 60 days unless Congress authorized the action. It sounded significant. In practice, every president since Nixon has either ignored it, worked around it, or disputed its constitutionality. It has never been enforced. So by the time Donald Trump ordered strikes on Iran on February 28, 2026, the legal architecture for doing so without Congress was already fully built. He did not break the system. He used it exactly as it had been designed, by decades of predecessors from both parties. Here is what Congress actually did when the strikes on Iran began. Republicans, almost unanimously, voted to greenlight the campaign after the fact in a non-binding expression of support. They did not authorize it, they endorsed it. The distinction matters legally, even if it evaporated politically. Democrats attempted a War Powers Resolution vote to restrict military action in Iran. It narrowly failed. A second vote is being prepared for mid-April. As of now, Congress has not acted. The war continues regardless. A growing number of Republican members, including combat veterans and former Special Forces operators, have voiced private and public concern about the direction of the campaign. One lawmaker, granted anonymity, warned that a ground invasion of Iran would cost the party 60 to 70 congressional seats in the midterms. Another, a former Navy SEAL, said publicly he was really hopeful this doesn't turn into a boots-on-the-ground situation. These are not fringe voices. They are members who voted for the strikes. Speaker Mike Johnson, when asked about the Marine deployment, said, "On record, I haven't seen the details of it." The Speaker of the House, the second in line to the presidency, the man constitutionally responsible for Congress's war-making authority. He had not been briefed on a deployment of thousands of Marines to a combat zone, whether that reflects a failure of executive communication or a deliberate choice to keep Congress uninformed. The effect is the same. The branch with the power was not in the room. The question this raises is not partisan, it is structural. What does it mean for American democracy when the branch assigned war-making authority is consistently the last to know, the slowest to act, and the least consequential to the outcome? The answer to that question shapes what the next conflict will look like, regardless of who is in the White House. There is another dimension of this conflict that bypassed Democratic approval. The cost reports from Washington indicate the administration is preparing to ask Congress for approximately $200 billion in emergency military funding for the Iran campaign. That is not the total cost of the war. That is a supplemental request on top of existing defense appropriations. For comparison, the entire annual U.S. federal education budget is roughly $80 billion. The emergency war bill is 2.5 times that. The economic consequences are already materializing before Congress votes on a dollar. Oil prices have surged as the Strait of Hormuz remains contested. Gasoline prices at the pump are rising. The president acknowledged this directly at the same dinner where he avoided the word war, saying Iran was a cancer, and the cost was worth paying. Republican members of Congress, watching their constituents pay more at the pump, are quietly calculating the political arithmetic of an extended campaign. Here is the Democratic paradox at the core of this. The people who will pay for this war, through taxes, through higher energy prices, through the risk carried by military families, never had representatives vote on whether it should happen. Congress may eventually vote on the funding, but the funding is for a conflict already underway, with costs already accumulating, with lives already at risk. Voting after the fact is not the same as authorizing before. The founders knew the difference. So, the war was started without a vote. It is being funded without a vote. And the people bearing the consequences, service members, their families, and every American paying at the pump, had no formal say. What happens next depends entirely on whether that changes. And to understand why it probably won't, we need to go back much further. So, the war was started without a vote. It is being funded without a vote. And the people bearing the consequences, service members, their families, and every American paying at the pump, had no formal say. What happens next depends entirely on whether that changes. And to understand why it probably won't, we need to go back much further. The deeper question, why Congress allowed this to happen, requires understanding the political incentives that made surrender easier than resistance. Voting to declare war is one of the most politically dangerous things a lawmaker can do. If the war goes badly, the vote follows them forever. If they vote against and the conflict succeeds, they look weak. The simplest political solution has always been to let the president act and claim credit if it works, distance if it doesn't. That is not cowardice. It is rational self-preservation. At democracy's expense, the result is a constitutional arrangement that exists on paper and disappears in practice. The founders wrote a check on executive war power. Congress cashed the check and handed it back. Every generation of lawmakers since 1952 has found it more comfortable to defer than to decide. And every president has been handed a power that was never formally granted, only never reclaimed. By 2026, the gap between constitutional text and constitutional practice is 8 decades wide. The Iran campaign did not create this gap. It simply made it visible, at a scale impossible to ignore. And what that visibility produces next is the most important political story in America right now. The answer is not obvious, but the pieces are in motion. Here is the consequence that survives this particular conflict regardless of how it ends. Every presidential power that goes unchallenged becomes a precedent. If the Iran campaign concludes, by negotiation, by Iranian capitulation, or by American withdrawal, without Congress ever formally reasserting its war-making authority, the next president inherits an even larger envelope of unilateral military power, Democrat or Republican. The institution expands with each use and never voluntarily contracts. Several legal scholars argue that the War Powers Resolution, despite never being enforced, still serves a function. It keeps the clock ticking. If ground troops are deployed in Iran, the 60-day withdrawal clock begins regardless of whether Congress votes. The administration could challenge it in court, but doing so makes the constitutional confrontation explicit, which carries its own political risks. The law unenforced still shapes behavior at the margins. Whether that is sufficient for a conflict of this scale is a legitimate question. The answer is probably no. The Democratic strategy, forcing a second war powers vote, faces the same arithmetic problem as the first. They need Republican defectors who are willing to defy the president publicly. Speaker Johnson has said he believes the operation is wrapping up. Representative Nancy Mace has suggested she could be the third Republican to break. The count is close. But close in a constitutional crisis is not the same as sufficient. A law that fails by one vote is still a failed law. The war continues, the clock runs. Whatever the outcome in Iran, whether the strait reopens through military force or diplomatic agreement, the constitutional question it has raised will outlast the conflict. The next president will inherit a military power shaped by what is decided, or not decided, in the next 30 days. That is the story underneath the strike counts and the deployment numbers. And it is the one that matters most in the long run. The last formal declaration of war was signed 84 years ago. Since then, every president has found a way around it, and no Congress has found the will to stop them. The Iran campaign is not the end of that story. It is its latest chapter, and possibly its most consequential one. The people paying for it deserve to understand what it costs, not just in dollars and lives, but in the democratic architecture that is supposed to govern both. If this episode gave you something, a question you did not have before, a thread worth pulling, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week we bring the same rigor to a new chapter, because the story of how power is exercised and who holds it accountable never actually ends. It only evolves, and the next development in this story is closer than you think.